Good afternoon. I didn't think that this would fit my head after it had been on Paul's head, but there we go. My subject this afternoon is very much looking to the future, and I suppose as the 12th speaker, I'm conscious that I don't want to repeat anything that the earlier speakers have said. So I'm going to try and concentrate at a macro level rather than a micro level. And as I say, I want to orientate towards the future rather than the past. But to do that, I happen to believe that we're at the very early stages of the knowledge economy. If you think of the Industrial Revolution, which is at this stage 160 years old, my belief is that the current evolution that we have of technology is going to sustain us for a very many number of decades into the future. Thank you. Consequence of which, I think we have a situation where to enable me to navigate that, because of the immaturity of what I want to talk about in information technology terms, I want to use initially the aviation industry as a surrogate and to draw some conclusions from that. So hence, we're going to get a lot of pictures of airplanes here in a minute somewhere, if I can get this to work. It's so far, oh, there we go. Oh, that's really done it. There we go. That way, thanks, okay. So, 1903, 17th of December, the Wright brothers succeeded for the first time in history to navigate a heavier-than-air machine over the Earth for about 1,000 yards, and so proved that man could in fact fly, other than in a balloon. Then 1919, we have Alcock and Brown, who famously landed in a field in Galway. They thought it was a field. It was in fact an Irish bog, which is a bit softer, and hence the aircraft at this rather strange angle. But the important point about this slide is these people were pioneers. They were pushing out the envelope of possibilities. They were testing what risks there are in the concept of flying, and therefore embracing that whole concept. 30 years on, we have the de Havilland Comet, which is the first effectively passenger jet aircraft. And 20 years beyond that, again, we had Concorde, which to me represents the acme of passenger flying, in flying across the Atlantic at Mach 2. And in a sense, the importance of this slide is both the quest for speed, which was the whole purpose in flying was to go faster, but the recognition that the accountants killed Concorde. Speed is no longer important in the airline industry. We've come back from flying at Mach 2 to flying subsonic. So again, an important evolution in relation to the industry. And of course, naturally speaking, flying is the most risky form of getting from A to B in theory. But in practice, it is actually the safest form. And when you recognize that there were 2 people across the Atlantic in 1919, there's about 250,000 people per day across the Atlantic currently. And the annual statistics for flying are about 3 billion people will fly this year. And not one of those sits on the aircraft thinking this is going to crash. They're more inclined to think they're going to win the lotto. And the odds, in fact, are much dissimilar. So flying has made itself safe with the emphasis on that aspect. The ultimate challenge then came at 9/11. Because the emphasis moved at that stage, not from safety, but to security. Because up to that point, the airline industry hadn't conceived that their aircraft could be used as weapons of mass destruction. And that caused them to suddenly recognize the needs to put much more protection into their systems. And it caused the death of 2,792 people before they came to that conclusion. My question is, what will have to happen in technology terms for us to take security seriously at the level in which I believe it needs to be taken seriously? Because I would argue, and I think some of what the earlier speakers have said would also point in the direction, that the potential exists for poor security to wreak more havoc on this planet than the entire economic crisis that we've just been through. And you've seen that in terms of some of the illustrations that have been quoted about the vulnerability of critical national infrastructure, which is a topic that I have a particular interest in and spend quite a lot of time upon. If we then turn to look at the internet, we recognize immediately the relatively young nature of the concept that we're talking about here. We're going back one level to 1988 there with the first chat relay. We see some of the names there that are now household names or brands to you, and we recognize that Facebook itself is only less than 10 years old. But as Paul indicated, the third largest country in the world with 900 million people. So that's one aspect. The second aspect is if you look at the speed dimension, and you look at the speed to get to 1 million users. America Online took 65 months to get there, whereas Draw Something took about 10 days. So again, you see the degree to which speed has become a critical feature of what's happening in terms of technology adoption. Currently on the planet, there's about 2 billion people who have access to the web. That grows at 500,000 a day, and the predictions are that will continue to grow as people continue to adopt technology. So that again gives, I suppose, if you like, the consumer view in relation to what's happening there. Consumers voting very much with their feet in terms of the criticality of technology and their uses of it. Now, however, the loss value that we're able to discern at the moment, and there were statistics earlier quoted, the most reliable statistics I'm able to come up with are that global cybercrime losses per annum are running in the region of 400 billion. And as Paul indicated earlier, that's equivalent to the combined market for heroin, marijuana, and cocaine worldwide. And the figures are growing fast. And you've got to ask yourself the question, if the figures are growing so fast, why are we allowing this to happen? Why aren't we doing more about it? And as Paul said earlier, Paul Byrne said earlier, he only knew of one case of cyber criminals being convicted in PBX fraud. And my experience in working with law enforcement is that there is relatively little catching of cyber criminals going on. And part of the reason for that is because of the protracted nature with which law enforcement operates across jurisdictions and borders, whereas technology crime is relatively borderless in the nature that they can transit through borders with no problem. Yet, coming in from Paris yesterday, I had to show my passport to get into the country, yet there's no requirement to validate any identity in using the internet in any particular jurisdiction. Now, what I want to share with you now is a model that I have evolved in relation to the fundamental parts of cybercrime, because to commit a crime, you need a motive, you need a method, and you need means. So I want to briefly go through those three facets in relation to where I believe we're at today. And it's a little bit like a Shakespearean play. There are only 4 actors in this play. Consumers in the top left quadrant, business in the lower quadrant, then beside that government, and then the criminals. So if we look at consumers first of all, what consumers want from the World Wide Web generally is ease of access, ease of use. The M generation, the 18 to 32-year-olds, don't believe they should pay for anything. Their belief is the web should be free, everything should be economically free. And you know, what was said earlier, if you get something for free, or get a product for free, then you are the product. And I think that's a very critical saying. So if you look on this axis on the left-hand side, what we see then is consumers who want to maximize and business who wants to optimize, because business is building all its strategies about the fact that consumers want to self-service, they want to move to the web, they like the accessibility, they like the speed, they like the certainty of the web, and this is driving the model. For business, it's also about making profit, it's about resale potential, and it's generally about cost control. I'll touch upon that further. Government has the responsibility of ensuring safety, security, order, good conduct, proper standards, etc. But again, government trying not to be overly obsessive in the market or in terms of society. So they're trying to minimize their footprint, minimize their involvement. But we heard from the Data Commissioner again, new laws, new regulations coming along, putting more and more onus upon business to have to police itself. And all governments and regulators do is sit back and simply fine you for failing to do what you're supposed to be doing. And then we turn to the criminals. And the interesting feature is that in the economic downturn, the people who've been investing are the criminals. And the obvious rationale why is because they're making a substantial fortune, and we've seen those numbers, out of criminal activity. And again, the sort of the top right corner there talks about financial gain, determined, well-organized, and international. So we aren't talking about some guy with a swag bag. We're actually talking about seriously, heavily intentioned criminals who are quite prepared, like investors, to put down money because they know on the back of that they can make major multiples. So, for example, if I'm paying 50 euros to buy a credit card detail, you can be certain that I will make at least 10 times that when I take that to the market. Otherwise, I wouldn't pay that amount of money for it. So on this side, you see a challenge between economics, accessibility, ease of use, and innovation. And against that, the whole question of freedom, standards, and proofs. And the tussle point is, in a sense, between commerce up and down here and control on the other side. Moving ahead to look at motives, what drives people. Consumers want choice. And obviously, the net gives them that choice through the potential for easy fulfillment, low-cost self-service. For business, it's a question of their go-to-market strategies. And for them, it's very much driven by the ease of customer fulfillment, flexibility, and the capacity to gain a fast strategy in relation to product, which they can innovate very quickly. Government, of course, is keen to engender competition because it believes competition is the essence of what will develop better services for consumers and also challenge business. So again, it's trying to liberate the citizens, as I've said, and affect lower prices and expanded choice, because that's what effectively competition comes down to. To the criminals, it's all about gain, because the web is facilitating crime through its ease of use, through concepts of remoteness, and through the anonymity which they can effectively achieve because of the lack of challenge, because of the lack of having to prove who you are before you can transact. I believe that situation long-term is unsustainable. I believe there has to be more validation of privileges, that if you want to use the web, you're going to have more ability to disclose in a researchable way or in a validatable manner who you are before you can achieve certain privileges. It doesn't stop you browsing, but if you want to transact, and you see that in a lot of what's evolving on the web generally. Finally then, to means and methods. And here we have the challenge between consumers who fundamentally are ignorant. I don't mean that offensively. I simply mean that in terms of who is responsible for the security of your domestic home PC or laptop, the reality is you are. How much devotion do you give to that? How much care do you take of it? Well, hands up those who haven't had a virus. Hands up those who haven't had spam. Hands up those who haven't had a phishing email. We're all getting them. So what's protecting us from that? We are being forced to protect ourselves, and the sophistication of what the criminals are doing is increasing at an almost exponential rate, such that, as in my opinion, the headroom between the criminals and the good guys is eroding all the time. And the question is, what's the flashover point? Will there become one where the criminals actually buy the brains? And I mean, zero-day attacks are a good illustration of where suddenly the criminal is attacking to a level to which the organization has not themselves yet been alerted, and puts the organization at an immediate disadvantage. In terms of, business itself, it's highly distracted. Business has been very distracted by the economic meltdown. So a lot of effort in business has gone and continues to go towards rebuilding profits, regaining markets. And when we look then at the actual technology, we've talked about a lot of this today, BYOD, virtualization, cloud, outsourcing. Outsourcing, I think, in particular, a challenge because, as said by the data commissioner, you can't opt out in terms of your requirements. Yet, in terms of who's actually validating what's going on in an outsourced situation, the belief tends to be, well, sure, we've given it away. It's not our problem any longer. It's somebody else's. But that's not true. It is still primeline your problem. When it goes wrong, you will be held to account for it, irrespective of who you're outsourcing to. And of course, why are you outsourcing? You're doing this usually for cost reasons, so it's perhaps a low-wage economy that you're outsourcing to, where the incentive is still very substantially to that low-wage economy for the people there to try and make themselves a bit more money on the back of recognizing the value of the data which you're passing to them. So we actually make the model fall in on itself. Government fundamentally, in my view, are disinterested, and other than some jurisdictions where they have definitely a sense of fear, and I'll touch upon that in a short time. And the criminals then are gaining intelligence because they're using means and methods that they understand and increasingly have been investing to perfect. And a lot of that comes down to the credibility of the spoof or the con. What I find is that there aren't many new crimes as such, but there is a big gap between the actual taking place of the crime and the sort of degree to which both the policing authorities and government have effective legislation to deal with that. And particularly this issue of cross-jurisdictional, because it's about 6 weeks it takes between one police authority has to go from the police authority through to the Foreign Office and then across to the other side and back down that jurisdiction before they can have a mutual recognition directive operating, mutual assistance directive operating, and that becomes quite debilitating in terms of the fact that most criminals know this and have long left the jurisdiction in terms of ability for the policing to catch up. So we have here the whole question of cost. At the bottom, I believe too little is being done and too late. On the other side, I think there's very poor detection and conviction going on because it's been seen as a victimless crime. What does it matter? You know, sure, aren't you insured? Won't that cover you? In fact, it won't, because one of the critical points is your data is not insured and your intellectual capital generally is not insured. Yes, the computers on which they sit, the actual physical assets are insured, but not the data. And that's very significant in a knowledge-based economy. So, let me then give a sort of a state of the universe overview in terms of where I see the future coming from. The first critical point is technology is the future. It is not going to reverse. We are not going to go back to the way things used to be. So technology has proven itself to be the vehicle of choice. And that's in terms of both consumers and business, and indeed the concepts such as e-government. So that to me is a momentum line. But traditionally what has always happened is that the criminals follow the money. That's always been the case. You heard the joke earlier about why do they rob banks? Well, it used to be because that's what the money was. I'm not so sure these days. But you know, they will continue to be incentivized by the fact that as business adopts the low-cost route, criminals will follow the money, because the money is where the data is, the money is where the information is, the money is where the opportunities arise, and they will continue to do that. They always have done. Governments are definitely concerned. We've seen some of the figures in relation to what governments are committing and financially. The UK government, we know, committed 650 million over 4 years to put into defending itself. They have ranked cyber as was one of the top 4 risks, and when you knock out H5N1 or H1N5, whatever it is, then definitely it's in the top 3 risks. Governments are concerned. There was a major conference in November last year hosted by British Foreign Secretary William Hague, at which both the British Prime Minister and the American Vice President Joe Biden appeared, either in presence or virtually. That indicates to me the extent to which senior governments do see the issue here. And it was only in June of 2011 that the American government went so far as to indicate their concern that if you're prepared to attack them in cyber, they now have indicated that they reserve the right to go to war with you on that basis. So that ups the ante substantially, and it also highlights how far they are seeing themselves major attacks taking place upon both the business of government and indeed upon the whole territory. I believe Stuxnet is massively significant, whether it's Stuxnet or the new family of Stuxnet, the Duku, the Gauss, the Flame. The family is emerging because Stuxnet is the genie that got out of the bottle. Stuxnet was the mistake that wasn't ever supposed to be made. Stuxnet builds a bridge between the electronic remote world and the physical world of electrical, mechanical, pneumatic, hydraulic. And so much of our world today is governed by things physical. And that was talked about earlier by Mark in relation to the whole question of physical infrastructure. And this is where the criticality of the national infrastructure does come into play, because if I was to set off an electromagnetic pulse over the country, I would fry every microprocessor underneath that. Technically, that is doable. The implication of it is absolutely massive. Everything would just freeze up. Your television wouldn't work, your car wouldn't work, traffic lights wouldn't work, nothing would work. So if I'm convinced that I want to cause major disruption, there are means and methods. And also bear in mind that there is now a European requirement to move to deploy smart metering across Europe by 2022. Smart metering means every household will have an intelligent meter, which means it will interoperate between the service supplier, be that water, power, that's electric or gas, and you, because what they want to do is to try and get more intelligent use of your resources. But that means intercommunicating, which means there's an opportunity then for somebody to attack that in a very obvious and potentially difficult way. So this is why I believe Stuxnet is highly significant, and I do work and have worked in this arena to try and up the understanding of what that means, particularly for SCADA-based systems. And this is the point I've been making about infrastructure. I've covered that now. Business has, and I believe continues to underinvest. You know, the comment was made by one of our speakers about how difficult it is to get money for information security. In the current crisis, capital spending is being cut, revenue spending is being cut, things are not being updated as regularly. So a lot of it is being driven by economic necessity in the current situation. But then the question is the adequacy and the effectiveness of what's there as it operates. At a senior level, I don't believe IT gets the proper hearing. There are very few IT representatives on boards of directors. So the decision-making, senior-most decision-making forum is probably not as informed as it should be. Second, I also believe that IT directors are probably not telling the full truth. That doesn't mean to say they're being untruthful. I just mean that they're being economic in not admitting how vulnerable they are and how much what they do is expected to happen okay. The belief tends to be two things. One, it'll be all right in the night, and two, it'll never happen to us. But the reality is, what goes around comes around. And in that situation, I think directors are not being adequately informed of all the risks that are being run, and therefore are living somewhat in a fool's paradise, which if they were better informed, they would certainly look at the opportunities to invest more into security. The economic crisis is a major factor in that, and I've touched upon that already. Staff equally are key. Staff were made reference of by Mark previously in terms of the people factor, and with unemployment being a feature, businesses reducing their workforces. You know, employees have a great ability to leave behind logic bombs, defective code. There are different ways in which employees can get even. They steal data, they work in different ways to satisfy their own needs in an economic meltdown situation that's particularly poignant because they often know all the routes and all the back doors and all the escape exits where the business may not. Social networking we've talked about, and it is a key feature. It's a key feature where the criminals are recognizing the value of social networking. They are milking it. They are organizing more and more on the basis of the credibility of the scams that they can mount, and they're being successful in doing that. They're duping people because of the fact they know more than people themselves are prepared to understand is the case, consequent of which some of these cons are highly specific, highly targeted, and vitally working. If you think of your Facebook and you post a photograph or a picture up on Facebook, you've got your GPS references now in most of those photographs. And let's say I send my holiday snaps from, I don't know, Mexico, and I'm, you know, showing off to my friends. But the criminals in spotting this say, but there's this guy who just sent a picture from Mexico half an hour ago. There's his home photographs of his barbecue last week. So suddenly now we then go on to Google Maps, and we pick up the picture of the house, and we pick up the entry route and the exit route, and we go on and commit a crime. It makes crime much easier, believe me. And I think the key thing is the speed with which it's happening, because it used to be that viruses would take 6 months to actually launch and perfect. Then that came down towards weeks, and it's now moving towards virtually days. And we know that the sheer number and scale of what are being produced on a regular basis is challenging the antivirus community in relation to responding. I was chatting recently with Eugene Krapowski of Krapowski Virus, and he was explaining a vision he has that in maybe 20 years' time, you will log on in the morning and it'll say, "Good morning, Citizen Kane. This is your government here. Today we're going to be discussing education reform. You have an opportunity to tune into the debate on this, and at the end of the day, you will have an opportunity to vote." Now, if that voting system isn't secure, and we live in a country which just has scrapped 50 million euros worth of voting machines. We've seen in Florida issues over voting. If that isn't secure, then the whole future of democracy has the potential to be challenged going forward. You think of the concept of the Arab Spring, where we all felt that technology was at root of enabling much of what happened in the Middle East to take place. Again, the vitality and the vibrancy of what's there can be challenged if the security is inadequate. So threats are increasing fast, and we need to recognize that. Generally, I find preparedness is poor. I recently came across an individual in London, a trader, whose PC was in the control of a Ukrainian command and control center. The implications of that are immense. What can they do? They could feed him false information. They could trade against him. They could force him to trade against himself. They could build false positions. The credibility of so much of what we take for granted and what we read on our screens suddenly becomes challenged, and the capacity then for the world to implode on itself increases massively if the information is poor. Therefore, how well do we understand what is running on our networks, what information is passing across our systems? And particularly back to the critical national infrastructure piece, not alone is it an issue of preparedness, but there's also a massive dependence upon actually a very few number of fiber optic cables that transit the globe, that carry the traffic that makes the World Wide Web. So even at a physical level, there is massive dependence. And we saw what happened when cables were cut in the Mediterranean a couple of years ago, and a major proportion of the traffic between North Africa and Europe was suddenly lost. We saw what happened when RIM had the BlackBerry outage. Some people thought they'd lost the power of their limbs. It was stunning to see just people freezing up on the basis of this. And finally, then, in my view, a lot more does require to be done. So let me give some indications of how I think that can happen. They say to fail to plan is to plan to fail. And certainly from my perspective, good planning has always been the basis of good execution. But the key point is you need to know the risks you face. This is about threats, and threats are about things that you haven't yet ingested. Once you ingest them, once you understand them, you can then convert them into risks. At that level, you can then map them, and you can then prioritize them, and then you can address your actions in relation to how to deal with them. That, in my opinion, is what good risk management is all about. What I find increasingly is that people are unaware of the risks they face, are not doing sufficient open research, don't understand what's out there as threats, and live in the hope that it'll never happen to them. Therefore, they don't efficiently plan their responses. They don't run scenarios in terms of what could happen. Could it be DDoS attack? Could it be data corruption, which is a very insidious thing? Or could it simply be that in the history of 176 years of banking, the Ulster Bank had never had a disruption in the nature of what occurred to it? It was more aggravated than the RBOS or NatWest situation because they were at the back of the queue. And this concept of the back of the queue is an interesting one because I came across it with a group called the Patcher Gang. And the Patcher Gang initially attacked Denmark, then they attacked Ireland, and then they attacked Greece. And the basis of their attack was they went for smaller countries where they knew they could get in and get out. And they knew specifically that in the time that they were there was unlikely to be a response from law enforcement, and more specifically, there was unlikely to be a response from the antivirus community, because the global antivirus community are only interested in big global viruses. They're not actually so interested in the more boutique or localized viruses. So again, you suddenly see vulnerabilities which can emerge as a consequence of how things go forward. The whole question of proving and testing your capability, I believe, is a vital one, and I think it's one that I see rarely effectively and well demonstrated in IT departments. What tends to happen is we do component testing, we do part system testing, but the whole idea of throwing the big switch and actually crashing the system and falling over to the alternatives is not one that appeals to IT directors. And I know, having been a CIO, at the time when I did a full system test, the overtime bill was 100,000 euros. I was not popular. But I proved something, which was that I at least understood at that point in time that I had sufficient capacity and availability and resilience to be able to fail my system over. But it is a challenge, and it remains a challenge to prove and test effectively. And I think the final point there is never cease to believe that you are a target, because any package that gets released today, any half-decent package that's being sold on the web, for example, if you look at online banking, just about any credible bank is included within the package. So even though you don't think you're a target, the likelihood is you have already been targeted and are included in the attack vectoring. So what then conclusions can we tell? I believe that if you seek, you will find. That is to say, if you go looking for the gaps and the holes which there are in your organization, you will definitely find them, because there's nowhere I go that doesn't have some either minor or in many cases major glaring holes in their systems and their configurations that would lead them to conclude they are very vulnerable. Second, there is no doubt in my mind that if you prepare, you will prosper. That is to say, if you make the effort. It reminds me of the old tiger in the jungle joke, that, you know, that there's two of you in the jungle and the tiger appears, what do you do? And the answer is, you've only got to outrun the other person. And the reality is in IT, you know, you don't have to be the absolute best. You just have to be above average, because the criminals, naturally enough, will take the line of least resistance, because that's what they do. Like water, they will take the line of least resistance. So if you happen to be the least well-prepared organization on the planet, or the least well-defended, you're going to find the criminals already at you. And indeed, from the intelligence I've got, this is old stuff, but I mean the Association of Chief Police Officers in the United Kingdom have been to the top 300 companies there and have advised them that in their opinion they have already been attacked, but they may not realize it. And that again comes back to the question of what do you know and what don't you know? And finally, my belief is that if you become idle, you will definitely fail. And I say that because the drop-dead nature of technology today is such that your consumers depend upon you for 24/7 by 365 availability. When I was running big systems, we dropped the system in 2002 for 50 minutes, and we made the media. We dropped it for 1.5 minutes in 2005, and we still made the media. Because in this country, there are 900 journalists a day hooked onto systems, and they're trying to make a living. And I was ultimately quoted denying that I had a security breach, because those words were put in my mouth. And what can I say? You have a security breach. No, I don't have a security breach. So I deny my own security breach, but I didn't have one. But that didn't matter, because the story was, I deny that I have a security breach, which immediately suggests that I might have had a security breach. So it's very hard to win in these situations, and the media and journalists are very active in trying to find stories, because this highlights again what they have been saying, which is that there is a lack of preparedness in this area, and we all need to be conscious of that. So on that basis, I shall stop and pass over to Paul. Thank you.